So we're sitting here together with David Neale from Fenergo, to discuss a case study and how the Payzaar platform has really transformed their global payroll operations and delivered great value to their entire business. So, hey, David, can you tell us about your role at Fenergo?
Yeah, so my role at Fenergo a couple of years ago was really around system implementation and finance transformation. And more recently now, once those tools have been in place, really focusing on the data around the company, the analytics and the reporting outputs.
Great, thank you. And can you tell us a little bit about Fenergo as a company, like the size, industry, the services you offer?
Yes, so Fenergo operates in the financial crime industry. And the way our CEO describes the company is we're almost like detectives in the financial world. So what we try to do is our software tries to do is prevent fraud, money laundering, and we work with a lot of the big national bodies like the FBI and those types of companies. So the software, the specific software is KYC, anti-money laundering, transactional monitoring, and we work with a lot of the global banks, a lot of tier 1, tier 2 banks across the world.
Well, that must be on the rise there in this day and age of technology as cybercrime, right?
Exactly. Yeah. Well, the nice thing is well, people are obviously conscious themselves of implementing to make things more efficient, but regulation also enforces it. So, it's companies have to get on board. So it is a bit of an easier sell, but we're trying to make that as efficient and painless as possible for our customers.
Great. Well, that almost sounds like how we want our customers to enjoy payroll, right? Easy implementation powered by tech. But let's bring it back to Fenergo's payroll, maybe. So, how many countries do you operate, and how many employees do you have across those countries?
So we currently operate with 15 pay countries. And within those countries, so some are very small. Ireland's our biggest country, which has in and around 300. Globally, just to put a kind of a rough number on it, we're about 700 employees. But Ireland, US, Australia, Canada are the largest of those. Ireland certainly the standout, and that's where the headquarters is based.
Uh-huh. Great. And has the footprint and the employee count changed since you started working with Payzaar, or has it been fairly stable?
Relatively stable. There's been a few countries. I'm trying to think. Dubai was one. I think Belgium or France we opened up recently. So it's been relatively stable. As I said, some of the satellite offices there could be less than 5 people. But yeah, we're always looking at expanding. But our global footprint, we've someone in Asia, North America. I think South America is probably the only area where we could potentially move into.
Okay, great. And in terms of the payroll team, how is the payroll team structured, and how many people are managing the perhaps domestic payroll, the international payrolls, and is it a mix of in-house or outsourced?
Yeah, great question. So, and certainly we can get into it. It's really evolved in the time over the last year or two, and a lot of that is due to the improvements on the process and the automation. But maybe if I can paint the picture, when I first joined, there was within the finance department, there was at least 3 staff that were, I would say, close to full time working on the payroll, and that they were dispersed across the various countries. So they usually, one person took 2 or 3. The majority of the way we structure is we have these local providers that do our payroll, but we are this was intermediary to give them the specific needs and data, review the data, etc. So that's within finance. They're then, if I'm talking about the before, within HR, there's probably another 2 or 3 that were managing, the human side of the changes, and they would pass that through the 3 individuals in finance. We have one of our payrolls is in-house, is the US, and we're looking actively to move that to a local provider on the ground. But our model really is certainly in the current state is get the changes efficiently through our HRIS system into our local providers via Payzaar, and then finance the representative in finance. So it's only one now that is actually covering all 3 of those roles,
Okay.
reviews the data. So a significant change in, let's say, human org structure around payroll in the last year and a half.
That's a great story, David. So you managed to kind of make it more efficient and reduce the headcount to managing the same type of scope. So that must have been then, before you implemented Payzaar, specific challenges that you were facing. Could you tell us a little bit about those challenges that led to finding a solution?
Yeah, like to name a couple, like each country was its own process, its own set of requirements, its own file. So just even how information was stored, how it was being transposed from HR, from say the employee to HR to the payroll provider, it was all individual to the country. So and I think the symptoms, a lot of that was Fenergo grew very quickly. So what might have been an okay process when we had 100 people or 150 people, the process became unmanageable very quickly. So I think that was one of the primary, so very bespoke processes across the countries. And then I think the second area was just around the data management. So system controls, approach, how to use data. So I suppose instead of having data structured in columns, it was just a text description saying, David Neale gets his pension updated to X, Y, and Z. So it was probably more of a know-how and an understanding of how an efficient data flow should operate.
All right, thanks. So it seems like it was very localized, local specific practices, which were good in the early days. But if you need to scale, you probably call for standardization. And that was hindered by your existing setup where you had in-house payrolls and local payroll providers that prevented you from harmonizing and standardizing it. Is that a fair summary, David?
That's a fair summary. And maybe just to add on the post gross to net phase, in the old world, really difficult to review, certainly in around, let's say, the annual pay run where we'd have all the bonuses and changes to salary, very cumbersome to review between actually what HR provided and what came back from the provider. So it was difficult to validate the information. And then the other element, which our new CFO really found difficult initially, was the analytics. So it was very difficult to look at can I get a total picture across the company? What are we paying? Who are we paying to? What are the different elements to make that up? That was nowhere to be seen. And if we wanted to do that type of reporting, it could take a week of manual, consolidation of loads of different Excel files.
Exactly. And were there also challenges in getting the payroll results into your finance ERP then?
Yes, the same, exactly. Yeah, exactly that. So actually twofold, both the ERP and our banking. So it was very manual, typed from the gross net back into another Excel, and then manually typed into, at that time, was Sage, was there a system of accounting, and then our banking platform. So it was across Bank of Ireland, AIB, all the various. We were manually going in per country, so it was very, very cumbersome and slow.
All right. Well, that sounds like people excelled in Excel before the days at Payzaar. Yes. So all of these kind of problem statements, what was kind of the business driver to then make a change of the as is to a to be situation?
Yeah, so really the driving force, the leadership team, right from the CEO, the new CFO came in, and they really wanted to instill efficiency, not just in payroll, right across, and the finance function was the pilot. So, there was a real review in terms of architecture, the way we do things. So systems, people, process. And it was, meticulously looked at each individual area. And payroll was one of the biggest pain points. And payroll is 80% of our costs. So it's a huge area for us. So if we can improve that, not only the efficiency and the headcount side of it, but the risk associated, the reputational damage if something was to go wrong. And what everything I said in the last part around the old state, like one thing I had real respect for was the individuals that were running the process, because it was so risk manual, and they still seemed to be able to get the payroll out in time. So it was definitely eye-opening as to how rigorous they were in their role as manual or maybe inefficient it was. So yeah, the real driver was this change from the top to just holistically look at all our systems and processes and look for that change that would allow us to scale and become more efficient in the future.
Exactly, and a very interesting metric you mentioned that payroll represents 80% of the company's costs, right? So in that process, you want to eliminate risk or mitigate risk and build in efficiencies to improve both upstream accuracy and downstream accuracy into the finance system, right? So that's great. Thanks for sharing. And then, of course, you wanted to deliver that change. So can you tell us a little bit about why did you choose Payzaar to solve those challenges and to meet those business drivers?
Yes. So I think one of the couple of core principles we were looking at was to trying to eliminate the number of systems we were using, to try and simplify the process, but also know that we're not in the nirvana state of our core architecture. So what I mean by that, our HRIS system was a very basic version. There was a certain amount of information in there, and other information was in other places. So what we didn't want to try and spend 2-3 years on a project to try and get change and change the whole world. So we were looking at what can we fix and help and aid the process with tools that we could quickly implement. So a lot of some of the other payroll consolidator tools we looked at. You're looking at a very long lead time to implement. A lot of business processes need to change. One of the distinctive advantages with Payzaar was, this plug and play, real easy to use. You can onboard countries as you want, and the cadence you want. But also what I liked was the modular basis. So, you can work on the GL part, get that up and running, get some value add. Then let's look at the HR piece. So you could keep tagging on functionality so you're seeing that value grow over time. So if I was to go look back at the assessment, it was, do we go with the big consolidator, the traditional payroll solution? There was obviously some pros with that. Or do we look at Payzaar, which is a bit more nimble and will suit Fenergo's growth model at that point in time?
Well, thanks. That's super interesting, Dave. So what I heard you say is you were looking for a fast ROI and to solve specific challenges like GL, like HR data at your own pace, and to kind of look at what do we want to solve first in terms of biggest challenges. And to aid that, I think you've mentioned the modular and ease of use of the Payzaar platform were important. But if you were to ask you, what was kind of the key differentiator where you thought, okay, this is now really moving the needle for me to actually choose Payzaar's platform as the platform of choice? What would be the one item you would mention, David?
I would say flexibility from a functionality perspective, and then from a cost and business sense, I would say it was a lot cheaper than other options.
Great. While still delivering a lot of value, that's great. And in terms of your evaluation process leading up to this assessment, how did you kind of evaluate the capabilities of the platform to make sure it actually met the business drivers and was solving your business challenges?
Yes, we did a bit of a current state analysis and mapped out, as messy as it was, the various steps that went on. And when we first engaged with Payzaar, we then measured the various steps, from HR changes, and I suppose if you look at the 7-step workflow, how each of those steps will be managed in the new world versus what we were doing. And we brought the various business teams in, so representatives from HR, from finance, and even some of the local providers, so not specifically in Fenergo, bring them in, engage them in early. And the feedback was really, really good from day one. So that's how we that pre-sales process, we kind of engaged and stepped through to see, each of those modules, where would we be extracting the value and how would we operate in a world of Payzaar.
That's great. So we valued all the internal stakeholders at Payzaar, but even included the existing partners to see if they were willing to work. And how did you find the adoption of the local partners to onboard to the platform to still work with their customer, Fenergo?
Yeah. Look, and I think it was, Payzaar at the time were very, the foresight. There was like, look, most providers we deal with, they're going to be very good, and that was our experience. There was one or two that were slower to adopt, or they were, trying to push us into their system. So they had their own, let's say, reporting layer that they wanted us to use, and they were slower to engage. So what we ended up doing was I'd say it was about 70-80% of our providers were very happy to move to the new process. They could see the benefit for both us and them. And then where we found, so we basically had, that was plan A. And then the providers that didn't fall into that bracket were plan B. And we have since migrated from them to providers that are engaged, maybe in other countries. So we've consolidated, let's say, our provider base on that. So yeah, we kind of took a pragmatic approach. We found one or two providers in the one Pacific UK provider, Iris, that they really onboarded, they adopted really well, and we got this blueprint, and we used that blueprint then for the other countries, which actually was really effective in how we rolled it out.
That's indeed a very pragmatic approach. That's great, David. Thanks for sharing. So let's move a bit towards implementation, because I think we're kind of have a storyline here where you've now made the decision to start with Payzaar, but then the implementation starts, right? So can you describe like your experience around the Payzaar implementations?
Yeah, so again, we took a kind of phased approach. We got a number of countries, the bigger ones, up and running, and again, using the modular structure Payzaar, we left the HR data grids piece to the side, because we knew there was more discovery we need to do on that end for the data preparation, and we focused on getting the entities in and onboarded one after another. So it was kind of one or two per month. Get the GL piece set up and starting to get that value add. So I think if you look at our system, our Payzaar system, you'll actually see the countries coming over about a 6 to 7 month period where we got all 15 in. So that was what I would call phase one, and it's the basic package, calendars, and we have the GL. We're getting a bit of interaction with the local providers. The finance and HR team are becoming familiar with the tool. And at that point then, other things were happening in the finance ecosystem, where we got a new ERP, we got a reporting data lake with AWS, or Oracle HRIS. We were getting better data there, more structured data. So when we moved into a phase two, and again, same sort of approach, iterative over the country, each country. So we started adding the data grids piece into the mix, rolling that out country by country. So that then again took about another 6 to 7 months by the time we completed it. But it was at that point then when we had really clean data coming in, really clean data coming out, and we were leveraging our data platform, AWS, then to help us both putting the data in and taking it out. So yeah, that was the journey in a nutshell.
That's a great journey. So, very pragmatic as well, David. That's what I hear across the whole journey so far. Like, get the countries in, get the teams familiar with the platform, standardize your workflow while keeping the local flexibility with the partners of your choice, solve the specific GL piece with your new finance ERP, getting the data into AWS, and then kind of a phase two when you've cleaned up the data at the upfront with Oracle HRIS, right, and get that data in. And throughout that whole journey, how was the experience of working with the Payzaar implementation team, the people behind the platform?
Yeah, no, excellent experience. And Ramses and Emery were with us, and they supported us along the way. And I've mentioned it a few times to them, but we actually use Payzaar as an example when we're talking to other suppliers and systems to say, this is what we were getting over here, implementing our payroll tool. So no, it's been really, really fantastic. And there has been, because of all of the change and transformation in Fenergo, there has been a bit of churn of staff and a lot of change. Some natural, some people maybe that moved on and they had their time. But again, every time there was a change, and that was another massive positive for Payzaar, upskill, the learning was light, but you also had the real expertise of Ramses and Emery there to guide them along. So no, that was, top notch from day one.
That's great. So I think you also mentioned like the platform, of course, is a self-service in terms of usability, but also in terms of configurability, right? So maybe during implementation, how quickly did your teams become familiar to actually manage the platform, not only from an operational perspective, but also from managing change and configuration changes throughout that journey?
Yeah, and again, the testament is, there's been a few different. I initially took on the administrative role, but quickly handed it over. And I think there's probably currently in the team 3 to 4 people who would have good expertise across the system, but that had changed over the year and a half, 2 years, many hands. So again, the ability to learn quickly and understand the system was definitely positive.
Great. And I think you mentioned a few times we have Oracle on the HR side. We have AWS as a data lake. What was your finance ERP again, David?
So our ERP is NetSuite currently.
Oracle. Okay, so Oracle and NetSuite. So I just want to unpick the 3 of those. So how smooth was kind of the integration towards Oracle NetSuite from the Payzaar platform for GL purposes?
But yeah, that was a real success, and it was very easy to get up and running. So once, I suppose, the challenge for us was more a business process. So understanding, here's the new set. So we went from Sage, as a context, we went from Sage to NetSuite, new chart of accounts. We cleaned up the GL structure. So the real challenge for us wasn't necessarily the functionality in Payzaar. We could map at that local tag level. It was just understanding our GL structure. But again, we made multiple changes on our side on the GL structure, and it was again so easy to back that update back into Payzaar per country. So we utilized some of the download, export, import functionality on the GL mapping, along with the global tags. So it was very seamless from a system administration. It was more a business process that we had to unbundle and unpick, but Payzaar facilitated that very well.
That's great to hear. Thanks, David. And let's maybe switch then to the AWS. So can you tell us a little bit about the value you get from getting all the global data out of the Payzaar platform into the AWS data lake, and how that kind of integration was running during implementation?
Yeah. So we use AWS to consolidate the changes, and as you know, changes come from various places, VHI, different health pension providers all across the globe for different countries. So we had a HRIS taking that data in, consolidating it, and this is again another testament to Payzaar. It was a beta product, so it was very new off the shelf, the SFTP integration into Payzaar. So we utilized that, and the Payzaar team worked with our developers very closely just to debug and make sure that all worked. And then, as you said, the bit that comes back out. So when we take all that consolidated global gross to net back out into our data platform, our HR team got very excited. So they did headcount forecasting, gender pay gap reporting. That was some of the regulatory reporting. So that was one facet to it, and they really used that data then to drive that reporting, and the accuracy and the timeliness of that data greatly improved. And then on the finance world, within NetSuite, traditionally we just had this P&L and gross pay, and we had no real double clickability. So bringing in this report, and we use a Power BI to sit on top of our platform, we could visualize the data, we could drill in to the employee level, for the right individual who had the permission to see that information. So if the CFO or the business leaders had specific questions on their headcount, it was super easy to drill in and see that information.
That's great. Finally own your data again and have it readily available whenever you need it, and engage with the stakeholders, right? Because if you, like all the countries you're in, there's different gross to net structures, there's different naming conventions, which becomes a big Excel exercise, as you mentioned, in the
100%.
state, which now makes it more seamless. I think that's great.
Yeah, 100%. The global tags and the flexibility with the global tags, it's great, and it does. And like, this is payroll is never going to change. There's always going to be those local columns where only France has something, and another country in Germany doesn't have it, and you're never getting away from that. So an ability to tie it all together in a common language is very valuable.
Excellent. Thanks, David. So let's maybe move over to kind of the results and improvements part. So what major improvements have you noticed in efficiency since you've been using Payzaar?
Yeah, and look, maybe to start, we had a company level OKR around this. So we've been had the watchful eye of the leaders in the business, and what we want to do, discussed earlier in the conversation, is we went from probably three full-time employees in finance, approximately 3 in HR, to now half of a full-time employee in finance, and 3/4 of a full-time employee in HR. So just measuring it on that basis. Now we are conducting some further dialogues at the minute, so we'll be able to actually refine that further. But purely just from a head count and a number of people involved in the process, that's massively reduced. Another piece of analysis we are working towards is around the number of touch points. So how many times is the data being touched? So another big, maybe failed to mention at the start, another big risk we had was a lot of spreadsheets were being passed around on the servers over emails, different password protected files, but same passwords for all the files. So it was very risky, and it was from a privacy and security perspective, a bit of a real red flag. So again, we want to reduce the number of human interaction touch points where we don't need them. So again, that's something we're actively measured, but just some initial insight is it's at least half in terms of the number of touch points, if not more.
That's great. Thanks, David. And have there been any noticeable reductions in payroll errors or improved data accuracy overall after the implementation of Payzaar?
Yeah, so a lot of I mentioned some of the complexity in unbundling of our GL. So we actually uncovered a lot of reporting issues in our old process. So all of them have been fixed. The timeliness of our payroll runs have now compressed massively. But one thing that we were able to do with the standardization across countries and the streamlining of the data transfer, we can now move all our payrolls to one date. So we were doing all different dates the last Friday, the 25th of the month, but now we have the facility to be able to move that all and compress it to one time. So yeah, in terms of errors, we've eliminated any timeliness issues or any issues with pay slips themselves.
That's interesting. So you've been able to harmonize the payroll calendar by introducing the Payzaar platform to make the process standardized across all of those different countries, while still allowing for local flexibility. As you've mentioned, in Belgium there might be this exception, in Germany there might be this exception. For you, from a central point of view, the payroll flows in the same way, and the payroll calendar is there. So in terms of the overall processing time, did you see any noticeable reduction in the number of days in that core payroll cycle?
Exactly. The whole cycle is being compressed. And one of the big issues with us trying to even move to harmonize that calendar or to put change was everyone was always full month, hands to the pump, working flat out. So it almost started from day one on month end all the way through the month, changes and iterations, and to finally get that pay slip out the door. So what we've been able to do now is we've compressed that down to about 6 or 7 days, where we get all the changes from start to finish. Now, I will say 7 days is from the point the data gets loaded from our HRIS. That goes now straight over to the provider with a little bit of a review on our side, and then the provider gets that back, gross to net, and we get the bank information all within 7 days. So that's our kind of SLA at the minute, whereas that was closer to 20 days in the old world.
Wow, so that's a massive 13-day reduction. That's amazing.
Yeah. But what we're really looking to get in, I suppose, within that 20 days, there was a lot of waiting and forward and back. So there was inefficiency. So we're trying to really get down into the nitty-gritty of how many hours, but we've managed to really push the whole cycle in. So in the rest of the month, we can then be working on, their activities, value add, instead of just those operational tasks.
It's not that those people will now sit idle for 13 days, right? They can.
No, but I'm sure they'd love that.
Yeah. All right. Thanks so much. So that's kind of the impact on the payroll function. So how has the Payzaar platform benefited other parts of the organization, like such as finance? Well, you're in finance and HR, and perhaps some other parts of the business as well.
Yeah, so our customer success department, they would have relied on Excel, a lot of different Excel files they were doing fully loaded costing for some of their utilization, resource costing. But now they can get a clean report from Payzaar, which, provides them the fully loaded cost for the cost centers that they're specifically interested in. So customer success world, as I mentioned, the HR department use it now for some gender pay reporting, headcount forecasting. Our FP&A team are using the data for budgeting and forecasting for future years. And what we plan to do is via the data lake is really start to harmonize various data sets across the company using Payzaar as one of the cornerstones, Oracle HRS, and it's all the way it's been set up using the employee identifier. We're then able to shift the data around and visualize it in many different ways.
That's amazing. So basically, every part of the organization is getting the data in a harmonized way from that 80% that represents the total cost. So you can better manage from every aspect the overall cost, which is great. And also, you've mentioned like pay gap reporting. There might be some ESG reporting that you now actually have access to all that data as you also the company. Yeah.
Yeah.
Great. And were there any other like broader organizational benefits around compliance, the risk and control environment that you've noticed throughout that change?
Yeah, well, certainly our privacy, our VP of privacy and security is very happy with the change. A lot of controls were put in place, and the number of and it's probably a good point, the number of people now in the company that have access to this data has greatly reduced. Now, and what I mean by that is people still have access to the data at the right level and the right aggregation, but the people that need to see the really sensitive information is just the people that need the information to perform their job. So we were able to limit that, whereas in the old world, a lot of people needed it for a means to an end, which obviously didn't satisfy our privacy team's wishes.
Exactly. All right. Thanks. Yeah, we sit on a lot of data, but the data is also very sensitive. So that's great. All right. Would you recommend Payzaar to any other company? And if so, why, David?
Certainly, the short answer is yes. What I'd say with someone is certainly in a Fenergo position. So someone that's come through that startup phase and they're looking at their system landscape, they're looking at their processes. I would say Payzaar is an excellent fit for getting some value adds, getting some structure on your process. It connects up. It's very flexible in terms of ERP choice, your HRS choice. It doesn't really matter. It's still going to work. It's still going to function. So I would say Payzaar is an excellent segue into that, and it actually then helps you uncover where your areas of issue are. So once you start looking at Payzaar, it'll force you to think about your data in a structured way. That pushes you back to the source problem. How do I organize myself better? So if you're looking for efficiencies quickly and help almost over a period where 2 years, we're still making changes due to having Payzaar in place. So it's a journey, but you can add value to the journey from day one.
Great. So I just have two final questions, David. So what kind of key, you've mentioned it a little bit, but just to reiterate it. So what key data or cost savings regarding budget allocation or headcount reduction would you want to highlight to us?
I think the key, and look, as I said, we all want headcount reduction in the right areas. We're not looking at removing staff, so we want to remove hours spent on non-value added activity. So the big one for us was really reducing where there was manual non-value add time to then using that same time to start actually looking at the data, connecting the dots, and creating insights for the business to drive performance. So that was our big headline. To do the percentages on it, you're going from 3 to a half on the finance world. That frees up a lot of capacity to work on other activities and projects.
There's also a big debate around global payroll having a seat at the table. But I think what you've delivered is that global payroll's data has a seat at the virtual table, because the data is now used by the key decision makers within your organization. Is that a fair observation, David?
100%. And back to the point of the 80% costs, if you can get your hands around that, it's and be really efficient with how you're deploying those resources. It's very valuable. It's extremely valuable. We haven't got into more advanced analytics where we can start looking at recruitment. We can start looking at other areas around HR data to predict things into the future. But the base level of our analytics is there. So the sky's the limit in terms of what we want to do next.
Exactly. The sky is the limit. Maybe even further than the sky we could go. Hey, one final question, David. So how do you plan to leverage Payzaar's capabilities to further drive efficiencies and innovation within Fenergo in the future?
Yeah, I think the one area we're still actively working on is we want to roll out the final module, which is the payslip distribution. So we have it in a number of the countries. We want to globalize that. Some of the countries are still emailing, so we want to get that, and we want to let the employees then be a little bit more self-serve, so to reduce some of the admin communication in terms of what does this mean. So we want to leverage Payzaar in the future on that across the group. Fenergo has plans to acquire companies now. If it's in the short to medium term, but we know we have a very a fantastic blueprint now for payroll, and it's very easy to plug and play. So in the event, we acquire a company, it has 5 different countries, let's say 5 different payrolls, we hand them the manual of this is how we do Payzaar. So we're very excited by that we now have a solution that not only is scalable organically, but through acquisition, we can really move quickly. I think we want to keep adding to our analytic capability. So as I said, we have that base layer of gross and nets. We want to start, I think once the business gets their hands on this data more and more, they're going to start looking at more ways to create. We might introduce more data points within Payzaar to be able to chop and slice and dice the data. So I think they're the big factors. I can't see Fenergo, expanding our country base to 30 anytime soon. So I do see that growing incrementally over time. But as I said, it's probably that real growth piece is around the acquisition and the blueprint for what we would expect for them if they came on board.
Thanks so much, David, for sharing all the insights and how the Payzaar platform helped you deliver the business drivers and the goals from your overall C-suite team. You're an amazing customer, super important to us. And we hope to chat with you soon. Thanks so much.